Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here with you. And I'll beg your indulgence because this is my first time to Houston. So be patient with me. I live and work in Washington, D.C., and that has its own blessings and challenges. But happy to be here with you today. My organization, PolicyLink, is a national action and research institute, and we work to advance economic and social equity. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And we've been doing a lot of work with Houston Tomorrow and H-GAC, in particular looking at what the changing demographics that you all are experiencing really means for regional growth and development. As an organization, we were really founded on the premise of your zip code not having to determine your opportunity and your trajectory in life. And that's something that we really feel like policy interventions are necessary in order to realize that future. So we've heard the term equity mentioned a few different times. I want to share what we at PolicyLink think about in terms of equity. It's really about just and fair inclusion, creating communities where all people, regardless of your race or ethnicity, your income, where you live, that you have the opportunity to participate and prosper. And so really what's important for us to think about is to put forth that as a marker, but also think about what does it take to get there. And it takes great intentionality, it takes focus, and it takes a real commitment to community engagement and acknowledging where people are at and determining a shared vision for the future in terms of where people are going. So what I want to say a little bit to kind of set up this conversation is really it's interesting to kind of think about where people are coming from. Jeff shared a lot of great graphs, and I'm looking forward to going to ourregion.org to take a look at that. He shared a lot about the differences in your age or your demographic background and how that shapes how you view issues. And so I think about myself. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and I came of age in the 1980s. And so for me, the idea of segregation of public facilities, be they trains, be they parks, schools by race is a foreign concept to me. That wasn't part of my experience. But I think about my mom, who grew up in Columbus, Georgia. That was certainly part of the experience that she had that formed and shaped her. And what's important to think about in trying to realize a more equitable future is that is what people are bringing into your regional planning process. That's what people are bringing into a transit corridor planning process or a neighborhood revitalization process. That's something to think about. And these pieces from the past really meet our present. A picture there of Trayvon Martin. And when we think about issues around being able to walk in your community, being able to get from one place to another with your family, with your kids, there's a different perspective in history that people will bring to that conversation around safe routes to school or complete streets. We have to acknowledge and see where people are coming from on that. So I think one of the things that's important, just to give you all a context, as I mentioned, we at PolicyLink have been looking a lot at the changing demographics in the country. And what I want to show you is a series of maps that show the changes by race in particular from 1980 and projecting into 2040. And what you'll see, kind of the light yellowish areas, those are counties where they're less than 40% of the population is people of color, African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans. And the orange counties are places where they're at a tipping point between 40 and 50%, and red is greater than 50%. So let's just take a look. It's 1980 or 1990, 2000. And you may not be able to see it, but between 1990 and 2000 is where the Houston region actually became greater than 50% people of color. 2010, looking at our most recent census, and looking into the future, 2020, 2030, and 2040. And so we're projected by 2043 to be a majority-minority nation across the country. And so what's interesting to see is kind of where those trends are happening, and we see it's across the southern part of the United States. So it's important for us to think about what that means. There are some places that haven't hit that tipping point yet. I was in a few weeks ago in Indiana, and what was interesting to see was how quickly Indianapolis was going to hit that tipping point, and the gap between when Indiana would hit it. And so the question for a lot of the folks there was, how do we make sure that we're building an infrastructure and communities that really serve the needs going forward. And so just to bring it back to Houston, we can see kind of the trends there starting in 1980 and going all the way to 2010, and seeing that 60% of the population, it's a minority population in Houston. So it's important to think about what this means for our infrastructure, and and kind of the trends that we're seeing as it relates to the changing population in this region. And what you can see here is the percent of the population that doesn't have access to a vehicle. And you can see for African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, it's certainly much higher percent that do not have access to a car. And I think the statement in David's opening presentation was of Houston being built around car culture. Well, let's just imagine that you don't have access to a vehicle, and think about how that limits your opportunity to hold down a job, limits your opportunity to take and transport your kids to work, and so, or your kids to school and that kind of thing. So I think it's important to really think about the differences that arise based on race and ethnicity. The other thing to think about, and Jeff was speaking to this around kind of travel time and the commute times, and the piece that I want you to kind of take away from this is if you take a look in the top left-hand corner and just kind of look at the hatched areas, those are the communities where there are census tracts where there are more than 90% people of color. And you can see along there, if you just kind of follow along what looks to be an arc there along the southern and eastern, going towards the north side, you'll see there's a lot of places there which are in the pink that are 32 minutes or longer in terms of travel times to work. And so it's important to really think about, well, what does that mean, practically speaking, in terms of time away from family and time on the road. So this, I think, just wanted to kind of raise the issue of thinking about income and how there are different opportunities and access to vehicle by income, and you can see the range. If you're making less than $10,000 a year on the far left end, 67% of those individuals are traveling by single occupant vehicle, whereas at the higher end of the income spectrum you see it's 84%. And this is similar data that David was sharing about what it means for transportation costs for moderate income individuals. And what's interesting in looking at that data, and I was looking at it, especially comparing it to Washington, D.C., was kind of the differences in what people are paying for transportation costs. And D.C. is known as a place with higher housing costs, certainly, than here in Houston. But what's interesting to see is in terms of, for Houston area, if you're a homeowner, you're spending more than a third of your income just on transportation. So more than 3 out of the $10 that you earn. And for moderate income renters, it's around the same. Interestingly, just by way of comparison for DC, homeowners are spending 22% of their income on transportation costs, and renters are spending about 20%. So something to think about in terms of what are some of the goals that we want to get out of our regional planning processes, and how we can make sure that they're benefiting low and moderate income individuals. And then the last piece that I think is important to really raise is the challenge of pedestrian safety. And what you can see here is that seniors, African Americans, Latinos are disproportionately represented when it comes to pedestrian fatalities. And there's similar injury data as well, and it's important to think about, you know, whether or not people are safe just going down the street. So how do we turn the curve on some of these trends? How do we move forward on some of these trends? And I think want you all to know, and you'll hear from Nick Donahue from Transportation for America right after this, PolicyLink really comes to the work of transportation through the Transportation for America campaign, really thinking about what's a way forward, what's a different way forward, a more equitable way forward, so that we are providing greater opportunities, so that streets are safer for you regardless of your race or ethnicity or income. How do we make sure that you've got affordable transportation choices and that it's not breaking the bank for individuals? And there's a number of organizations, civil rights groups, faith-based organizations, economic justice organizations who really looked at the transportation bill and the development of it, MAP 21, as an opportunity to really turn that curve, to change some of those trends, to ready ourselves for the changing demographics in our nation, and that the bill itself provides that opportunity, given the volume of federal money coming to regions and the opportunities there. And so PolicyLink serves as chair of what's called the Equity Caucus at Transportation for America, that's really put a focus and a real deep look at what are some of the policies that help turn the curve for us. And so these are some of the organizations that are a part of the Equity Caucus. And so we really set about to, you know, kind of frame a set of principles that we thought would help to move the needle on equity in America. And I offer these as ways of kind of thinking about even how you might seek to make decisions in the region, in your community, and across communities as ways forward. So what are the four principles here? Create affordable transportation options. That's really about, are there ways that people can get around by bicycle, by transit, by walking, and are those affordable options for individuals? The second principle around kind of workforce development and access to careers that are created. What's interesting is that 1 out of 10 jobs in the country is a transportation-related job. What's also important to note, we've been looking at data around who gets access to those jobs. And for many of those jobs, they can be middle-class jobs. They can be ones that provide family-supporting wages. However, the challenge is that if you look at women and African Americans, they're severely underrepresented as their proportion in the overall workforce, in the transportation construction sector in particular, when we're thinking about building highways and roads. So it's important to look at what are some of the career pathways and how do we foster those as we're building new light rail projects, as we're doing bus rapid transit, as we're building and repairing bridges and highways. The other piece is around promoting healthy, safe, and inclusive communities, and it's clear from Jeff's presentation that that is where the effort there is looking to go, is making sure that there's sets of communities across the region that are safe and equitable. And then the last piece is really around focusing on results. One way to think about how to turn the curve is to actually set goals for yourself, set performance outcomes for how we might measure how well our transportation systems are doing in terms of providing affordable choices, in terms of connecting us to jobs via public transportation and other means, and setting real objectives around that, and setting objectives around trying to reduce the number of fatalities that are experienced, particularly amongst populations that are disproportionately impacted. So some of the opportunities within MAP 21.1 in particular that wanted to point you to was around transit operating assistance. Some of you all may know that in the nation there has been a real ridership boom when it comes to transit, and you all have experienced that. I know, and I've heard from that the projections for the ridership for the light rail has far exceeded the projections there, and that's a benefit and a challenge as well. There are a lot of transit agencies around the country that are really struggling to keep service in place, to maintain fares, and one of the options that's been provided in the new transportation bill, MAP 21, is some operating assistance, particularly allowing transit agencies to utilize some of the resources that they might reserve for expanding their services to actually continue to operate their services so that they don't have to cut routes or raise fares. And so there's some options, particularly for some of the smaller agencies like the Fort Bend County Public Transportation Services, and the Harris County Community Service Department operates some transit services as well, and so there's up to about $600,000 that the Federal Transit Administration has made or has allowed those agencies to be able to use. The other piece is around workforce development and local hire, and thinking about utilizing disadvantaged businesses, i.e. businesses that are owned and operated by women and by minorities as well. And so thinking about how do we make sure we're actually, as we make our investments in infrastructure, that we are creating opportunities for entrepreneurship, particularly for underrepresented populations. And then the other piece is around preservation of affordable housing near transit. And what's important to think about in terms of that, you know, it's not your preservation strategies for affordable housing around transit are important to think about, and it's important to make sure that they fit your community. There's some studies which tell us that where transit is provided in a community, the property values go up, and we saw that from David's presentation. The other piece of that, and the flip side of that coin, is that in many cases, some of the lower income families have to move out of the community, are displaced, either because they're renters or have challenges affording the taxes, etc. And what we see there is that actually creates a bit of a destabilization effect for transit, right? Because many of those lower or moderate income households were utilizing transit, and many of the higher income households that come in and replace them are ones that are not using transit as much, and so that makes the ridership go down, which creates a real challenge for the transit agency. So it's important to think about what are the kinds of strategies, whether it is land banking or whether it is affordable housing covenants. There's a range of options that are out there, but it's important to think about what's most appropriate for your particular market, and in particular for those that you're working with. So, and that actually leads me to just a couple of examples for you to think about going forward. One of the places where we've worked is Minneapolis and St. Paul, and one of the things that we did there, they too are doing a lot of investment in light rail. They've got a $1 billion project where they're looking to connect downtown Minneapolis with St. Paul through a light rail line. And one of the things that they did was they took a health impact assessment approach. And when you think health impact assessment, you might think, okay, that's about air quality, that's about safety, that's about water quality, all of those kind of health, obesity, those kinds of things. that is a piece of it, but they looked at broader factors, and it's really a lens about what is the total health of the community, their ability to lead a quality of life, and really getting back to, is your zip code really determining your opportunity. And what was interesting to come out of what is a transit project, transit-oriented development project, is that they prioritize the need to look at planning and zoning policy, which is a really interesting thing that came up as part of the survey as well from Jeff's results. They prioritize wanting to have an inclusionary zoning policy along the light rail line that would allow for keeping in place some of the affordable housing that was there, and they were also interested in retaining some of the local businesses. So it's interesting that through that health impact assessment lens, you end up with a solution that's really around planning and zoning. And then the other piece that I wanted to just highlight for you as an example that we've been looking at that we're very intrigued by and think is a successful model, and one you all may want to think about, is in the San Francisco Bay Area. There's a program called the Boards and Commissions Leadership Institute. And so David and Jeff both talked about the need to create essentially stewards for the future regional development of the Houston area. And I think that is certainly the folks in this room, given that you've come out here on an afternoon to talk about these issues. I think it's important to think about how we equip individuals. Jeff raised real intention around trying to bring in underrepresented communities into the process, and this is one way that has been tested and proven of doing just that. And really the program is around making sure and identifying some leaders in those underrepresented communities and making sure that they are equipped to be at the decision-making table and give input in a substantive kind of way. So around the San Francisco Bay Area, they have commissions for air quality and for, there's a metropolitan planning organization, there's a water quality district, all of these commissions. And what this program does is takes people through A to Z, through the alphabet soup that is all of those governance structures, lets them know where are the points of impact, how the decisions that are made by one body affect a region or affect another body, and really kind of demystifies that process. So what you have are people who are prepared, who are representative of the communities that are important for you to really be thinking about, and they, the other part of this is there's placement, and they've had 24 fellows, and all of them have been placed on a board or commission there. And so if you're talking about trying to think about how you have decision-making bodies be representative of your changing demographics, this is a model that's worth looking at, and I'm happy to share a little bit more about it later. And I just want to conclude with a couple of other tools and resources. There's several that we've put together. Why Place and Race Matters. It has a focus on California, but there's a number of examples and case studies there that are worth your review. America's Tomorrow is our report that really looks at the demographic maps that I showed and talks about what are some of the kind of creative solutions that communities around the country are looking at to address some of the challenges and opportunities presented by the changing demographics. The Healthy Corridor for All really summarizes the work that we did in the Twin Cities around the transit and the light rail project, and there's a host of other resources as well. But I will stop there and see if anybody has any questions, actually, for myself or for Jeff as well.